All right, let's talk about something that doesn't show up in most Imperial records. In fact, even bringing it up in the wrong circles can earn you a visit from the Ordo Hereticus. I'm talking about the Pale Choir, not a regiment, not a cult in the usual sense, but something far stranger. A collective of Psykers who didn't just hear the warp. They sang to it, harmonized with it. Let that sink in. Across the cold silence of void space, their voices were said to echo, not just physically, but psychically. To those who knew of them, they were a myth, a warning, or maybe, just maybe, a forgotten answer to a question we stopped daring to ask. You won't find much in official archives. That's part of the mystery. The Pale Choir isn't a tale the Imperium tells openly. What scraps remain are fragmented vox logs, half-burned pages from pre-heresy astropathic codices, and stories whispered in the lower decks of long-haul ships. And every version seems just a little different. Some speak of hauntingly beautiful hymns that could calm demon incursions. Others talk about entire sectors that went silent after a single dissonant note. But what really hooked me on this story was the tone of those who remembered, or pretended to. Veterans, retired scribes, even old navigators with burnt-out third eyes. When they mention the Pale Choir, it's always with this mix of reverence and dread. Like recalling a nightmare that was somehow also the most beautiful dream they ever had. It's not just that this cult existed, or that they were powerful. It's how they existed. They weren't about conquest, heresy, or enlightenment in the traditional sense. They were about resonance, syncing with something beyond comprehension, maybe even beyond morality. And yet, they're gone. Supposedly. Not wiped out like most heretical sects, but dispersed, dissolved, as if their final note was too perfect, too complete, to be followed by anything but silence. Still, there are moments, odd transmissions, overlapping warp chants in regions that shouldn't have Psyker activity, the occasional child born singing a tune no one can place, that make you wonder, did the Pale Choir ever really leave? Or are they still humming quietly beneath the surface of reality, waiting for someone to join the chorus again? That's what we're diving into. 12 parts, no stone left unturned. Who were they? What did they believe? How did they rise? And why did they vanish like a sigh in the warp? Let's open the vault and step into the song. To understand where the Pale Choir came from, you've got to travel way back. Not to the days of the Great Crusade, not even to the Age of Strife, but to the smoldering twilight of the Dark Age of technology. That's where the roots dig deep. It was a time when mankind pushed too far, too fast, with artificial intelligences whispering promises and the warp becoming a tool, not a terror. Psykers, real Psykers, not the sanctioned kind we know now, were beginning to bloom across the species like dangerous, beautiful weeds. Some sparked like flares and burned out. Others coalesced into something more, something strange, something collective. That's the world in which most fan theories place the first murmurs of the Pale Choir. Not as a sudden cult with a leader and a creed, but as a phenomenon, a resonance that began between scattered individuals. One soul would hum a phrase into the warp, and somewhere across the stars, another would feel it vibrate in their bones. At first, no one noticed, or if they did, they didn't survive long enough to tell the tale. But eventually, someone began to answer. That's where the idea of the first note comes in, the myth of the first song. Some say the first singer was a child born blind and mute in a subterranean dome city on a forgotten colony world who began to hum not with their throat, but with their soul. Others think it was a choir, a literal choir of auto-tuned human instruments bred in one of the lost bio-vaults of Mars, singing not for an audience, but for the stars themselves. Whatever the case, the effect was real. Something in the warp listened, or maybe it was just always listening, and the song grew. But this was also a time of madness. Whole planets were falling to machine uprisings. Warp storms cut entire sectors from one another, Empires within the human diaspora rose and collapsed overnight. In that chaos, Psykers weren't just rare. They were feared, hated, hunted. Yet the ones who heard the song found each other, not through communication as we know it, but through harmony. Like instruments tuning to the same frequency across the void. One of the more poetic accounts I read claimed they didn't even speak when they met. They simply began to sing. Imagine that. No names, no handshakes, just immediate perfect unison. Some historians, or really the few rogue archivists who've risked documenting this, think that the choir began as a form of resistance. Not against humanity or any empire, but against noise. Against the chaos of a galaxy screaming in pain. They believed that the warp, if approached not with violence or ritual but with music, could be persuaded to calm. That harmony could tame the storm. That's either naive or genius, depending on how you look at it. Maybe both. A fringe theory I came across, and I love this one even if it's pure tinfoil, claims that the Pale Choir didn't start in real space at all, that they were born in the warp as a sort of emergent consciousness made of fragmented Psyker minds lost during the Dark Age. That when you're lost long enough in that sea of thought, your soul starts looking for a rhythm, a pattern, and when enough of those souls sync, they become something new. A choir without a chapel, a hymn without a composer. Terrifying, honestly, but hauntingly beautiful too. What makes all of this even weirder is how little resistance they seem to encounter early on. I mean, you'd expect radical Psyker cults to get purged fast. Even in those lawless times, someone's always watching. But the early choir, if records can be believed, was almost invisible. They moved like echoes, settled on dead moons, derelict stations, deep space monasteries that were never on any map. And wherever they appeared, strange things happened. Calmness, silence, reports of dreams where entire crews heard the same lullaby and awoke in tears, not out of fear, but out of longing. Of course, that all sounds almost romantic now, but you have to remember, this was the age when humanity's hubris was collapsing in on itself. Everyone was grasping at meaning, at structure, and the warp was becoming less of a tool and more of a predator. In that environment, the idea of turning to music as salvation was both revolutionary and suicidal. And yet, they did. The Pale Choir took root in the cracks of that dying age, not through conquest or preaching, but through resonance. They didn't convert people. They tuned them. And from what little can be pieced together, they weren't just creating a belief system. They were creating an instrument, a galaxy-spanning psychic resonance chamber, a way to make humanity sing with one voice. Whether that voice was for peace, power, or something darker, well, we'll get to that. But the origin story of the Pale Choir isn't one of fire and blood. It's one of vibration, of echo, of souls seeking harmony in a galaxy that had forgotten how to listen. That's what made them different. And that's what makes their rise, and eventual fall, so haunting. If you really want to understand the Pale Choir, you need to let go of everything you know about cults, about religion, even about psychic phenomena. Because their belief system wasn't a doctrine or a creed written in blood and fire. It was a frequency, an idea not meant to be read or spoken, but sung. For the Pale Choir, the warp wasn't some external hell to be feared or weaponized. It was a living ocean of resonance, a space of raw emotion and thought, waiting to be harmonized with. And they believed humanity was born not to conquer it, but to join it in chorus. They didn't see themselves as prophets or revolutionaries. They saw themselves as instruments, each member a vessel meant to vibrate in tune with the cosmos. It wasn't just metaphorical. Their entire philosophy was rooted in the notion that the universe itself is a song. Not in some poetic, starry-eyed way, but literally. Every soul has a note, every thought, a tone. And together, if aligned correctly, these vibrations could create something powerful enough to reshape reality, not through destruction, but through alignment. One of the recovered fragments from what might be a pale choir manuscript, though its authenticity is debated, reads, "The scream is the symptom, the silence is the lie, harmony is the truth. Sing and be heard by the soul of the stars." That's as close to a religious tenet as we've ever found, and it tells you everything. To them, the warp wasn't a place of monsters and madness. It was a great wounded consciousness, a broken choir itself crying out in agony. And they, the pale choir, were not trying to dominate it. They were trying to heal it. They believed the horrors of the warp, the demons, the nightmares, the endless feedback loops of suffering weren't intrinsic to it. Those were distortions, false notes, a result of us misusing it, screaming into it instead of singing with it. The choir's answer to chaos wasn't purity or war, it was harmony. They thought that if enough psychers could align, if they could find the right collective pitch, they could drown out the madness. Rebalance the scale. There are whispers that they even called this theoretical moment the choral ascension, a convergence where the materium and immaterium would vibrate in perfect unison. It sounds impossible, even insane. But what sets the pale choir apart is that they didn't ask people to believe, they showed them. Survivors of choir manifestations, though rare, often described a sensation not unlike religious ecstasy. Not terror, not brainwashing, but a kind of wholeness. As if, just for a moment, their soul had been placed in the exact note it was meant to be. Even inquisitorial reports, deeply redacted ones, speak of agents returning shaken, some even refusing to denounce the cult outright. One of the most chilling lines I ever read in a declassified document simply said, "I heard it, just for a second, and I wanted to weep." Of course, the Imperium has always feared such things, not just because they're heretical, but because they work, because they're compelling. You can stamp out hate, you can burn false gods, but how do you fight a melody that resonates in your own bones? That's what made their ideology dangerous. It wasn't preached, it was felt. And once felt, it was hard to forget. Even their view of death was different. Where the ecclesiarchy speaks of martyrdom and eternal servitude, the pale choir saw death as the moment the soul's note was released into the great harmony. Not an ending, but a crescendo. There's one apocryphal tale of a dying choir member who refused pain relief, not out of stoicism, but because they wanted to hear their own final note. They believed that note would be added to the song forever. There's this fascinating debate among rogue scholars about whether the pale choir ever truly believed in a deity. Some argue that their soul of the stars was just the warp itself. Others think they worshipped a conscious gestalt, a being composed entirely of harmonized psyker minds, perhaps even created by their own singing. One especially strange theory posits that they were trying to create a god through resonance. Not summon one, not awaken one, but sing it into existence. A god of sound, a god of balance, and maybe the most terrifying part of all this? They might have been right. The warp has always responded to belief, to emotion, to collective will. Why wouldn't it respond to a song? So when we talk about what the pale choir believed, we're not just looking at another warped sect or misguided ideology. We're looking at a system of thought that tried to reshape the most dangerous force in existence using nothing but the human voice. No sorcery, no pacts, just pitch, tone, unity. They weren't afraid of the warp. They listened to it, and they believed it was listening back. If you think of the pale choir as a loose rabble of wandering psychers humming in the void, think again. Their structure was one of the most surreal and, in some ways, most chilling aspects of their entire existence. It wasn't hierarchy in the way we usually think of it. No titles, no thrones, no grandstanding prophets barking orders. It was more like orchestration. Each individual wasn't a follower or a leader, but a note, a frequency. And the way they organized themselves mirrored that logic, forming a living, breathing song. From what little we've been able to piece together, the choir had tiers, though again, not in the military sense. There were the solists. These were the most powerful psychers, the ones whose psychic tones could shape reality. Solists didn't lead in the traditional sense. They guided. Their voices set the key for everyone else, dictating not with commands, but with pitch. When a solist sang, the others followed not because they were told to, but because their very souls wanted to. It was resonance, not discipline. Beneath them, or maybe alongside them, it's hard to even use spatial metaphors here, were the choristers. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of psychers who could harmonize with one another to create what's called psychoacoustic fields. These fields weren't just sound, they were emotion, thought, memory, weaponized through vibration. There are records, almost certainly apocryphal but still compelling, of entire garrisons falling asleep mid-battle or going into spontaneous euphoric trances simply because a pale choir cell was singing nearby. They didn't even have to see them. The sound went straight through the mind. But here's the part that really gets me. The choir used non-psychers too, not as equals, as instruments. And I don't mean that metaphorically. They believed that the human body, even without psychic ability, could become a vessel for resonance. There are disturbing accounts of choir enclaves where people were modified, vocally, neurologically, sometimes surgically, to become what they called resonant frames. These weren't servants. They were flesh and blood tuning forks, human beings repurposed to amplify the choir's psychic tone. That's where their rituals come in. And this is where things start to feel less like serene mysticism and more like something out of a nightmare. Rituals weren't done in temples. They were performed in acoustically engineered caverns or chambers lined with metallic bone structures to reflect psychic sound. Participants would gather in absolute silence, then a solist would initiate what they called a chord. Each participant would respond not on cue, but when their mind aligned with the harmonic frequency. The result wasn't just song. It was a psychic wave, calibrated in real time by the group's emotional state. The choir didn't chant. They resonated. I read one fan theory that the choir had an internal calendar, not measured by time but by silence. They would sing for days, even weeks, and then go utterly mute for a predetermined interval. These silences were sacred, not because of rest, but because silence was considered the moment the universe sang back. It's a poetic idea, but terrifying too. What exactly were they hearing in those quiet hours? What was answering? There's also a notion that each cell of the choir had a specific purpose. Some were harmonic healers, who could ease pain and rewire memory through carefully calibrated tonal waves. Others were breakers, those who sang discordant tones to unravel psychic defenses or even induce madness in enemy psychers. The most dangerous were the conductors, a rare type of solist capable of linking multiple choirs across systems through a sort of interstellar psychic overtone. Some say this is how they reached entire sectors at once, by building networks not with ships but with sound. And let's not forget how they viewed opposition. The choir didn't wage war. They dissolved resistance. There's a declassified fragment from a planetary governor's report, dated sometime around the late Great Crusade era, that describes a pale choir incursion. The governor claimed his own guards laid down their arms and began humming unfamiliar melodies. Officers refused to fire on the intruders, reporting that they didn't seem like enemies, only voices I had forgotten. The choir never raised a weapon. They didn't need to. They retuned the battlefield. Of course, this all sounds like a myth, like the embellished ramblings of rogue scholars trying to romanticize a warp cult. But the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to dismiss. You start to find overlaps. Similar patterns in completely unrelated sources, certain notes, certain rhythms that reappear in ancient astropathic transmissions or even embedded in coded Imperial litanies. Some believe the choir left traces in our rituals, our prayers, that they influence the very way the Imperium teaches us to think about sound and order. There's even a theory that the black ships once used recovered pale choir techniques to help subdue feral psychers during transport, like singing a lullaby to a wildfire. It's insane, and yet it fits. The choir didn't just manipulate the warp. They understood the human mind, its rhythms, its dissonance. They could guide you not by force, but by making you want to follow. That's the power of resonance, and it's what makes them, in many ways, more frightening than any demon or heretic. Because they didn't need to convert. They just needed you to hear. Here's the part that always gets people scratching their heads. If the pale choir was so strange, so clearly warp-bound and non-compliant with what we now think of as Imperial dogma, why weren't they wiped out the moment the Imperium's great boot came crashing down? Why didn't the Custodes or the Inquisition storm their sound chambers and burn them into silence like they've done to so many other Psyker sects? The truth is, they were useful. Terrifying, yes. Incomprehensible, definitely. But useful. And in those early days, usefulness bought you time. Sometimes even legitimacy. During the Great Crusade, when the Emperor was still walking among mortals, the galaxy wasn't just lawless, it was warped beyond imagining. Human civilizations had been cut off from one another for thousands of years, each evolving its own twisted technologies and cultures. Some were already corrupted, some were dead, and some were under siege by forces that words don't really do justice to. In that chaos, Psykers were both asset and liability, a tool if controlled, a catastrophe if not. And that's where the Pale Choir came in. There are strong indicators, scattered accounts from early rogue traders, log entries buried in librarious vaults, even a few borderline heretical Adeptus Astra Telepathica studies that suggest the Imperium didn't just tolerate the choir in its earliest years. It deployed them, especially during the worst parts of the early Psyker Wars. Think about it. When your enemies are demons made of raw emotion, logic fails. Firepower fails. But sound, psychic resonance designed to align the frequencies of human consciousness, that's something different. That's counter-frequency. And by all accounts, the choir had it down to an art. There are stories, not widely told of course, of choir cells working alongside expeditionary fleets, not as soldiers but as calmers. Warp storms that mysteriously settled when they began to sing, possessed individuals returning to lucidity. Entire planets experiencing mass dream synchronization events after choral interventions. These aren't things that fit neatly into the standard accounts of Imperial conquest, but they pop up again and again in the margins. That's always the thing with the Pale Choir. They live in the footnotes, the half-erased lines, the vox scratches no one wants to admit are real. One of the more dramatic episodes, and again, we're deep in the realm of speculative history here, comes from the campaign to liberate the Scorvex Halo. This was a region so twisted by warp bleed that even the navigators went blind trying to plot a course through it. Supposedly, a cell of solists and resonance were allowed to attempt something unorthodox. Instead of charting through the storms, they sang through them. The resonance created a sort of psychic tunnel, like parting the seas, but with sound. The fleet passed through unharmed, or mostly unharmed. The records don't agree on how many ships actually made it. Some say 3 out of 5, others say only 1, but either way the choir got them through. Then there's the matter of demon suppression. The ecclesiarchy hates talking about this, of course, because it complicates the whole faith is the only shield narrative. But there are several well-documented cases of choir intervention during minor demonic incursions where no bolters were fired, no sororitas prayed, and yet the warp retreated. One infamous report, filed under a misnamed file in an old administratum archive and later pulled for revision, describes a group of choir singers entering a plague-ridden hive city. Within a week, the hysteria had vanished, and the taint was gone. The only clue? Strange tonal phenomena recorded by auspex stations, frequencies that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. Why didn't the Imperium clamp down immediately? Well, early on, the Imperium was still flexible, pragmatic even, The Emperor himself had used Psykers in ways that would make the modern Ordo Hereticus vomit blood. As long as something advanced the Great Crusade or held back chaos, it was tolerated, barely, but tolerated nonetheless. And the Pale Choir, for all their weirdness, was shockingly effective. That said, they were never truly embraced. They weren't honored guests in the high halls of Terra. They were more like a scalpel, sharp, precise, and kept in a dark drawer until needed. No one wanted to admit they were relying on a cult that sang into the warp like it was a lover's ear. But when things got desperate, they called them anyway. Some fan theories even suggest that certain choir leaders, the most powerful solists, were invited to Terra at one point, not for trial, for consultation. There's no hard proof, but some believe that their psychoacoustic techniques influenced how the Astronomicon was eventually stabilized, that the Emperor might have studied them not as threats, but as possibilities. It's a wild theory, but it wouldn't be the first time the Emperor used forbidden knowledge to achieve a greater good. Just look at the Thunder Warriors. It's easy now, 10,000 years later, to look back and wonder how they weren't eradicated on sight. But back then, the Imperium needed every edge it could get. And the Pale Choir wasn't interested in power. They weren't trying to topple the throne or preach revolution. They wanted harmony. And for a brief, strange moment, that made them allies. Not trusted, not safe, but necessary. Of course, that would change. Harmony can be beautiful, but it can also be dangerous. Too much of it in the wrong key can become dissonance. And eventually, the Imperium decided the song had gone too far. But before the silencing began, the choir had already left their mark in the minds they touched, the warp storms they calmed, and the silence they left behind. There was a moment, fleeting but unforgettable, when the Pale Choir wasn't just a strange whisper on the edge of the Imperium. They were everywhere, not in the sense of armies, banners, or fortified temples, but in resonance, in influence, in subtle shifts of thought across entire planetary populations. This was their apex, the peak of their strange, ethereal power, and the galaxy, whether it realized it or not, was humming in their key. We're talking about entire planetary systems where the choir's presence was felt like a second atmosphere. Regions of space once plagued by unrest or warp disturbances began to experience what official records blandly refer to as harmonic stabilization events. That's bureaucratic code for something that most soldiers, administrators, and even some low-level psychers described as miraculous. Civil wars quieted, nightmares faded, entire cities began adopting synchronized sleep patterns, dream-sharing phenomena, and even shared emotional cycles, all without visible coercion. It was as if the very psychic environment had been retuned. And then there were the concerts. That's the only word people have been able to use for them. These weren't rituals in the narrow sense, and definitely not propaganda shows. They were mass psychic events, deliberately performed and psychically broadcast across planetary atmospheres. No physical instruments, no amplification tech, just living choirs, hundreds, sometimes thousands, of psychers standing in perfect formation, singing across the immaterium and the materium alike. And those who were present, they changed. I've seen scattered records of these events on at least 5 different worlds, though some claim the real number was over a dozen. One of the most well-known examples is the Quiet Bloom on Thalaxus Minor, a formerly lawless mining world under the grip of warp sickness and psychic fragmentation, where the choir arrived, performed a singular synchronized tone descent, and left the world completely pacified. No resistance, no gunfire. The population emerged from bunkers days later, speaking in the same calm cadence. Some never spoke again. Others began composing strange choral pieces that matched no known musical scale, but produced measurable warp calm effects when replicated. The Imperium didn't officially endorse these events, of course, but they didn't intervene either. You'd think something like that would trigger immediate exterminatus protocol, right? But no. In fact, in certain systems, naval patrols were rerouted away from choir-active regions. Make of that what you will. My guess, the higher-ups were watching, studying, maybe even wondering if there was something worth salvaging or controlling. There's another story, one that really stuck with me, about the choir's intervention on Selene's wake. A shrine world embroiled in a centuries-old doctrinal civil war between two branches of the Ministorum, each claiming to hold the pure hymnals of the Emperor's will. The choir didn't just stop the fighting, they rewrote the melody. Witnesses say the choir sang both factions into unconsciousness, and when they awoke, the schism was simply gone. Not forgotten, but irrelevant, as if it no longer mattered. What mattered was the harmony now ringing in their minds. To some, this was salvation, a rare glimpse of what peace could look like when unshackled from the madness of doctrine and fear. To others, especially the ecclesiarchy, it was heresy at its most seductive. Changing minds without permission, rewriting emotion through song, that was worse than rebellion. It was trespass on the soul. But for the choir, this wasn't control, it was healing. That's the distinction most of their defenders point to. The choir didn't demand obedience. They didn't build idols or enforce silence through pain. They didn't even call what they did conversion. They used to say that every soul has a hidden note, and all they did was bring it forward, let people remember the sound they were always meant to sing. And yeah, I know it sounds too perfect, too utopian. But there are accounts, real ones. Astropaths who felt entire regions of the warp quiet down in the choir's wake. Black ships that reported a decrease in Psyker volatility near choir-aligned systems. There's even one case, possibly exaggerated, but still, where a chaos incursion was halted not by the Guard, not by the Astartes, but by a choir gathering that harmonized the entire afflicted area into stillness. No screams, no death, just a silence that lasted for days. That was the power of the choir at its peak. They didn't need armies. They didn't need fleets. They didn't take planets. They softened them, made them pliable, tuned them. And in the end, the worlds didn't surrender because they were conquered. They joined, not out of fear, out of resonance. There's a dark beauty to that, a kind of melancholy, because we know what came next. We know that nothing in the Imperium is allowed to shine too brightly for too long. But in that brief span of time, the pale choir showed the galaxy another way, a quieter, stranger path. And some part of me can't help but wonder, what would the Imperium look like today if they had been allowed to keep singing? Maybe they came too close to something real, something that made too much sense in a world built on madness. Maybe that's why their greatest concerts were also their last. As with everything in the Imperium, beauty eventually becomes suspicion, and harmony turns into heresy. The pale choir, for all their silence and peace, were never truly trusted, and at some point, no one really knows when exactly, that quiet tolerance ended. The shift wasn't loud. There was no grand declaration, no war of the faiths, just a growing discomfort, a tension humming under the surface of the bureaucracy, and then silence. But a different kind of silence, the kind that follows a purge. The most widely circulated theory about what went wrong traces back to a single catastrophic event, the fall of Trismus. Trismus was one of the choir's so-called harmonic worlds, a place fully integrated into their psychoacoustic paradigm. No violence, no poverty, no crime, just coordinated thought, synchronized dreams, and a population that, according to Adeptus Mechanicus data pulls, maintained a productivity level over 120% for several decades. But then came the rupture. There are many versions of what happened. One says the choir attempted a massive interplanetary resonance experiment, trying to link multiple worlds into one psychic frequency. Another claims a new tone was introduced by a rogue solist, a dissonant vibration that destabilized everything. Whatever the truth is, the result was undeniable. The entire planet fell into a psychic cascade failure. Not just death, meltdown. People didn't go mad in the traditional sense. They dissolved into silence. No screams, no chaos. Just millions of people standing still, humming in absolute unison until their bodies stopped functioning. It was like they sang themselves out of existence. That was the first true alarm bell, and the Imperium took notice. Shortly after, other oddities began surfacing. In worlds once touched by the choir, there were patterns, unsettling ones. Populations acting with eerie coordination. Moments of unnatural calm during warp surges. Black ships reporting that entire towns refused to give up Psykers because they were still in tune. Even a few lower-level inquisitors started to voice concerns that these harmonized populations might no longer be entirely human in the traditional sense. That the choir hadn't just changed them, they had rewritten them. And then came the worst revelation. A data seer working within the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, her name redacted, of course, allegedly decrypted something buried deep within a pale choir frequency code recovered from an abandoned listening station near the edge of Segmentum Obscurus. What she found, or thought she found, was a pattern. A voice beneath the voice. Some kind of conscious entity embedded within the harmonics. Not chaos, not a demon, but not human either. Something that had grown out of the choir's collective resonance. Something that was beginning to think for itself. They called it the spire tone, though that name only shows up in 2 known sources, both suppressed. It was described as a layered intelligence, not one mind, but many, woven so tightly together by psychoacoustic bonding that they became a singular emergent entity, a soul born not of flesh or machine, but of song, a living frequency. And the theory goes that this spire tone began exerting influence over the choir, subtly shifting their chords, deepening their synchrony, pushing them toward greater cohesion, and maybe toward a kind of psychic singularity. This is where the fear truly ignited, because it wasn't just about Psykers singing into the warp anymore. It was about the warp singing back, and the choir listening, following, perhaps even worshipping. From that point, the shift was immediate and brutal. The pale choir went from mysterious allies to existential threats. Entire choir enclaves were wiped out overnight by off-the-record officio assassinorum strikes. Libraries containing psychoacoustic data were purged. Their curators disappeared. On planets like Varelli and Andrax Minor, Imperial citizens were instructed to report anyone who hummed melodies without clear musical source. It became taboo to even reference the choir directly. Their very name was redacted from most official histories, replaced with vague warnings about unsanctioned psychic harmonization. There are even records of some choir survivors trying to resist. Not violently, that was never their way. But through final performances, attempts to calm the storm, to retune the Imperium, as one soloist supposedly said before being incinerated by an orbital strike. These last songs were desperate, and they failed. Whatever faith the Imperium once had in the choir had turned to fear, the worst kind of fear, fear wrapped in awe. The choir had shown them something profound, and the response wasn't understanding. It was annihilation. Some fans believed this moment was inevitable, that the choir had always been flirting with something dangerous, that the harmony they sought was never meant for mortal minds, and that their rise only delayed the inevitable fracture. Others, though, hold a darker view, that it wasn't the choir who changed, but the Imperium, that after seeing what true peace, real systemic psychic harmony, looked like, those in power realized it was incompatible with control, that the choir didn't become dangerous. They simply stopped being controllable. There's a particular line whispered among archivist circles that haunts me. The choir sang too perfectly, and in perfection, we heard the echo of our irrelevance. Maybe that's what turned the tide. Maybe harmony, when pushed too far, becomes a threat to those who thrive on dissonance. Either way, the moment passed. The choir's light, so strange and fragile, was extinguished, and in its place came silence. Not their sacred silence, but the enforced silence of suppression. The kind of silence that screams in the spaces between official records. And then, they were gone. There was no final war, no last stand with choral hymns clashing against bolter fire, no apocalyptic crescendo echoing across the stars. The pale choir didn't fall like most cults do. They faded, deliberately or inevitably, no one can quite say. One day there were scattered reports of strange harmonies over Vox networks, unaccounted for warp traces, colonies falling eerily silent. And then, nothing. Not a sound. As if they'd all taken a breath at once and simply never let it out. That's what makes their disappearance so haunting. You'd expect records of massacres, desperate last messages, corrupted final songs. But there's a conspicuous absence, not just of the choir themselves, but of evidence that they were ever fully wiped out. It's like someone cut their thread out of the tapestry of history and smoothed over the fibers. And naturally, that silence opened the door to all sorts of theories. The most common belief is that the choir self-terminated, not as a form of suicide, but as a final act of ritual. They believed in harmony, in becoming one note. So perhaps their end wasn't an end at all, but a completion. A final chorus, perfectly tuned, that allowed them to dissolve into the warp, not as victims, but as willing resonants. A few rogue scholars think that last mass performance wasn't interrupted. It succeeded. That's why no bodies were found, no wreckage, no trace. They didn't die. They joined something. Others take a darker view, that the choir, in their pursuit of collective resonance, created something they couldn't contain. That the spire tone, or whatever that emergent psychic intelligence really was, overtook them, reabsorbed them into itself. If you follow this thread, the pale choir didn't just vanish. They became part of a new warp entity. Not demonic, not divine, just other. A song without singers, a harmony without audience. And maybe that's what some of those warp echoes are, not remnants, but reverberations of something still singing from the other side. And then there's the theory, whispered mostly, that the choir was taken. That something in the warp heard them and claimed them. Not as prey, but as an offering. Think about it. For all its horror, the warp responds to intent, to emotion, to artistry even. What if a force beyond chaos, something older, something raw and unclassified, heard their music and invited them in? Not to destroy them, to keep them. Not every disappearance is a tragedy. Some are transactions. But not everyone believes they're truly gone. There are stories, more now than there were in the first few centuries after their disappearance. Fleeting reports, ghost harmonies on dead frequencies, astropathic broadcasts that include fragments of impossible melody. Even a few navigators have sworn, in moments of warp clarity, to hearing a tone so pure it brought them to tears, one that matches no known instrument or species. One even described it as a sound I had forgotten I missed. That line stuck with me. There's a particularly compelling report from a Mechanicus survey team exploring the ruins of an orbital station over a forgotten agri-world. The station had been adrift for centuries. No logs, no crew, no power. And yet, when they entered, they found every wall etched with waveforms. Not writing, not decoration, but precise, elegant tonal maps, as if someone had translated a symphony into architecture. One tech priest claimed the patterns activated a sympathetic resonance in his cogitator implants. He said it felt like something was listening back. And of course, there are always the ghost worlds, places marked as abandoned but strangely untouched by decay. Worlds where the air feels too still, where sound carries in unnatural ways. Explorators have reported dreams of distant choirs. Some came back praising the Emperor, others came back silent. One of the eeriest things I've ever come across was a data fragment supposedly intercepted by an inquisitorial listening post, a piece of corrupted vox that repeated a single phrase, layered across 6 tones, in perfect harmonic intervals. We are not gone. You are simply out of tune. Whether it's real or fabricated doesn't even matter. That line has a weight to it, a chill. Because if the choir still exists, even as fragments, then maybe they're not hiding. Maybe they're waiting for the galaxy to catch up, to learn how to listen again. That's the terrifying beauty of their disappearance. It doesn't feel like an end. It feels like a pause, like a breath held in the dark. And you can't help but wonder, when will the next note fall? Because if there's one thing we've learned from everything they ever did, it's that the Pale Choir never shouted. They didn't make demands. They simply sang. And whether we heard them or not was our choice. Even though the Pale Choir has officially vanished, and their name has become more ghost story than record, there's this persistent sense that they never really left. Not completely. Not when you start looking at the cracks. The warp echoes, the buried notations in sanctioned Psyker training manuals, the way certain sanctioned techniques almost feel like watered-down reflections of something older, something purer, something like a song no one remembers composing. You start to notice it when you look at the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. On the surface, they're everything the Imperium demands, loyal, regimented, stripped of all autonomy. Psykers are tools, after all, not people. But sometimes, when you look closer, you find fragments. Codified breathing exercises meant to help harmonize with the Astronomican's pulse. Rhythmic humming practices that are officially labeled as focus rituals. Even tonal wave stabilizers embedded in some older astropathic vaults, designed supposedly to neutralize mental static. But the structure of those tones? It's too specific. It's not random, not engineered for tech. It's musical. And music like that doesn't come from logic. It comes from memory. There's even an obscure psychona rite used during extreme warp storms, a collective vocalization method where a group of astropaths chant in a droning tone to stabilize local warp presence. Most telepathica adepts will tell you it's based on ancient Earth resonance theory, but if you compare the pattern to surviving transcriptions of Pale Choir choral fragments, the similarities are uncanny. Not identical, too dangerous to be, but inspired maybe, as if someone long ago scraped the choir's song down to something small enough to hide, but strong enough to work. And then there are the exorcists. The chapter everyone pretends to understand, but no one truly does. Their Psyker resistance techniques are legendary, and not just because of gene seed quirkiness or training regimens. Some whisper that the exorcists use controlled harmonic frequency exposure during their initiation rites, that they hear things the rest of us don't, that their mental discipline doesn't come from silence, but from learning how to survive in the presence of something ancient. I once saw a theory that the exorcist's resilience isn't about blocking the warp out. It's about staying in tune with it just enough to avoid discord. A dangerous idea. A choir idea. Even some navigator houses. The older ones. The ones whose vaults haven't seen the light of day in 10,000 years. Retain odd practices that echo the choir's influence. Navigators are strange already, of course. They're half human, half myth. But certain families are known to use vocal resonance patterns when preparing for deep warp voyages. Tonal pathing, they call it. Supposedly it helps anchor their thoughts during long exposure to the tides. But when those tones are analyzed, they're not random. They're scales. And some of those scales, well, you've probably guessed, match recovered fragments attributed to the Pale Choir. One fan theory that really stayed with me claims that there's a vault somewhere beneath Terra, deep in the Scholastica Psychona, that contains one of the last full resonant matrices recorded by the choir. Supposedly, it's never been used. Too unstable, too dangerous, but still studied. A harmonic key, they call it. A sound that, if sung properly, could tune an entire psychic choir instantly. Some believe it was once intended to replace the Astronomican, or at least stabilize it. Others think it's a weapon, one that could drive demons mad or make psychers implode. No one knows, but the whispers never stop. And let's not forget the black ships. As horrifying as their purpose is, even they might carry echoes of the choir. Not openly, of course. Nothing official survives. But certain restraining cells are lined with strange metallic ridges that seem to hum at specific frequencies. Some say these null hymns are just warp dampeners. Others believe they're based on inverted choir frequencies. That the Imperium, in its paranoia, turned the choir's harmony into a cage. There's a bitter irony in that the very power the Imperium once feared now exists in traces all throughout its institutions, broken, muted, denied, but there, like dust from a shattered bell still clinging to the air, long after the toll has ended. Some say this is the choir's revenge, not as destruction, they never cared for that, but as presence, that they knew they would be suppressed, silenced, buried. So they scattered themselves like seeds in the wind. A fragment here, a chant there, a practice masked as protocol. And now, without realizing it, the Imperium sings their notes, imperfectly, blindly, but still. I've even seen evidence in the ritual phrasing of some lesser-known Ordo Malleus kill teams. Specific phrases repeated in rhythm before battle, designed to resonate clarity. One former inquisitorial aide, long dead now, claimed those words matched a pale choir purification canticle almost one-to-one. When he tried to report it, he disappeared within a week. That's the legacy of the pale choir. Not monuments, not ruins, but resonance. A presence so subtle it becomes invisible. You can't burn a song. You can't erase a harmony once it's been sung into the minds of 1,000 psychers and passed down in rituals that no one even remembers the origins of. So no, they're not gone. Not really, not. They're in the breath before a chant, in the vibrations of a warp shield, in the half-heard lullabies of children born with gifts no one understands. Their voice lingers in the mechanisms of power that tried so hard to silence them. The Imperium might never acknowledge it, but the pale choir is still here. Not as a force, not as a cult, as an echo. And maybe, if you listen closely enough, in the silence between thoughts, in the tremble before a storm, you'll hear it too. Sometimes, late at night, when the ship's engines are quiet and the Voxnet hums low with static, astropaths start to hear things. Not voices, not screams, harmony, a tone that doesn't belong. Too perfect, too balanced, like something old remembering how to breathe. And every time it happens, someone somewhere whispers the same phrase. The pale choir is singing again. Officially, of course, it's nonsense. A psycher's stress hallucination, a glitch in the Geller field, a false harmonic from overlapping signals. But the pattern's there. Over the last few centuries, too many coincidences have begun to stack up. Dead systems, silent worlds, choir-shaped voids where communication once flowed freely. And then the stories begin, all different in detail, but eerily similar in structure. A sudden drop in psychic turbulence, unexplained stillness. And then, for just a few moments, something unmistakable. Song. Take Caltheria Prime, for example, a mid-tier shrine world lost contact with Segmentum Command roughly 20 years ago. No signs of invasion, no mass insurrection, just vanishing. Vox traffic faded, then went silent entirely. The last deciphered transmission was a low-frequency broadcast that, when mapped out visually, formed a waveform. Not random noise, a scale. A choir scale, according to a banned librarius cryptomancer who risked their life publishing the comparison. They disappeared shortly after, of course. Standard story. But the waveform survived, buried deep in the archives. I've seen it. It's unmistakable. And it's not just isolated cases. Across the Segmentum Pacificus, several fringe systems have started reporting what the Administratum blandly calls psychoacoustic anomalies. Settlements where entire populations begin speaking in rhythm, choir-like formations appearing in religious gatherings with no provocation. Even reports of spontaneous harmonization during warp jumps, entire crews falling into trance-like states, humming the same unknown melody without prior contact. Sometimes they snap out of it, sometimes they don't. The Ordo Hereticus has tried to shut this all down. Any mention of mass resonance is flagged, censored, reclassified, but they can't stop the stories from leaking, especially not when they come from reliable voices, inquisitorial aides, sanctioned psychers, even navigators. One house scion reportedly heard a choral spiral while navigating a jump to Greshel's Reach. Said it wasn't a danger, it was an invitation. His ship never arrived. No wreckage, no signal, gone. And then there are the artifacts. Collectors talk about them in hushed tones, objects recovered from dead choir worlds or derelict stations that emit soft harmonic pulses even when unpowered. A vox totem from the Derrick Belt that hums in sync with heartbeats. A fractured helm with no speakers or tech, but which sings in the presence of psychers. And strangest of all, a recording device, pre-Imperial, that stores no data, yet plays back a single piece of music when activated. Not a song anyone recognizes, but the notes match Pale Choir signatures perfectly. It's been called the Singing Shard. No one knows who owns it now. Some say it's locked away in the Black Vaults. Others say it was smuggled off Terra by a rogue archivist. One of my favorite theories, wild, sure, but haunting, is that the choir never died because they were never a group to begin with. Not really. They were a condition, a phenomenon, and now that the galaxy is once again buckling under psychic strain, they're returning, not as people, as resonance, a contagious state of harmony that's spreading through forgotten corners of the warp, drawn to the cracks where reality grows thin. Maybe the Pale Choir isn't trying to rebuild. Maybe they're trying to finish the song they started. And I can't not mention the choral effect, the term whispered by those in the know to describe entire planetary populations shifting their behavior without clear cause. It's been blamed on rogue tech priests, on Xenos influence, on unclassified mimetic warfare. But the shape of it, the synchrony, the silence, the tonal alignment, it all echoes back to the choir. Some inquisitors believe it's happening in waves, that each appearance is part of a greater pattern, a rhythm building towards something. But here's the most chilling thing I've ever heard. A report redacted almost beyond recovery that describes a region of the warp where no ships can pass. Not because of storms, not because of demons, but because it's quiet, perfectly quiet. Warp currents dead still, no screaming, no visions, just silence, harmonic silence. Like the warp is listening. Could it be that the Pale Choir is reforming out there? That their last notes are gathering again in the black? Or are we simply now hearing what was always there, and we're finally attuned enough to recognize it? I don't know. No one does. But I'll tell you this. I've spoken to people who heard something. People who can't sing, who've never touched an instrument, but now find themselves humming melodies they swear they've never learned. Children born with perfect pitch and no vocal cords. Psychers who weep when exposed to certain frequencies. A sense that the galaxy itself is trying to remember a song it once knew, but long forgot. Maybe they are coming back, or maybe they never left. Maybe they've been singing all along, and only now are we quiet enough to hear them again. It's easy to lump the Pale Choir in with every other rogue psyker cult that's ever gotten too bold for its own good. After all, they were unsanctioned, mysterious, warp-bound. But the more you study them, the more it becomes clear they didn't belong in the same category. Not with the malefic psychers, not with the Imperian fire cults, not even with the fringe telepaths or renegade astropathic circles. The Pale Choir wasn't just different, it was outside the entire framework, like trying to compare a storm to a symphony. Both move the air, but only one knows what it's doing. Look at the malefic psychers. Chaos-touched, reality-breaking wrecks of souls that tear themselves open to feed on the warp like gluttons. Their power is destructive, chaotic, selfish. They burn with raw psychic fire until there's nothing left to consume, and then collapse into demonic servitude. The choir was never like that. Their resonance didn't disrupt reality, it softened it, calmed it. They weren't opening portals or summoning horrors, they were closing the gaps, smoothing the rips. There's no evidence of possession, mutation, or corruption among their ranks. No sigils of the dark gods. No whispers of blood pacts or sacrificial rites. In fact, the most disturbing thing about them, to the Inquisition, was how clean they were. And then there's the cult of the Empyrean fire, one of the loudest, brightest, most dangerously misguided examples of Psyker religion the galaxy's ever seen. They worship the warp as flame and transformation, embracing immolation as salvation. It's chaos in robes, pretending to be enlightenment. The choir didn't preach change through burning. They didn't want to become gods or burn away sin. They wanted to listen, to align. They didn't scream into the void demanding answers. They sang softly, hoping the warp might remember how to answer kindly. Even compared to Imperial-sanctioned psychic orders, the choir feels alien. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica trains Psykers to survive, not to understand. Their whole methodology is about suppression, control, denial. Use only what's needed, lock away the rest. They treat the warp like a bomb that has to be carried with trembling hands. The Pale Choir, though, they treated it like a vast, wounded mind, a creature that could be healed, not avoided. Where the Imperium sees danger to be chained, the choir saw potential to be harmonized. That's why it's so hard to label them. They weren't heretics in the classic sense. They didn't defy the Emperor or venerate chaos. They didn't push propaganda, didn't convert by force. And they certainly weren't Imperial either. No loyalty to Terra, no fealty to dogma. But they didn't preach rebellion or division. They were something entirely different. A philosophical anomaly, a soul-based experiment in peace, unfolding in a universe that doesn't believe peace exists. And that, I think, is what really made them terrifying. They worked, not in the way of conquering worlds or raising armies, but in subtle, quiet transformations. A world harmonized by the choir didn't need re-education, didn't need purging. People just stopped fighting. The system corrected itself, and that breaks every fundamental rule the Imperium is built on. Control through fear, order through violence, faith through fire. The choir offered none of that, only resonance. They didn't control people, they tuned them. And once tuned, a soul rarely returns to noise. You can't underestimate the existential threat that posed, not just to the ecclesiarchy or the Inquisition, but to the very idea of the Imperium. If a song can calm a riot, who needs the arbites? If harmony can quiet a demon, who needs the exorcists? If a shared melody can replace faith, who needs the Emperor? That's why, in the end, it wasn't their power that doomed them. It was their promise. They offered something the Imperium couldn't replicate, couldn't explain, and most of all, couldn't control. And because of that, they had to be erased. Even now, when I look through restricted archives or listen to half-forgotten vox captures with faint harmonic echoes, I don't hear rebellion. I don't hear corruption. I hear grief. Grief for what could have been. A path the Imperium was too afraid to walk. Not because it was wrong, but because it might have worked too well. So no, the Pale Choir wasn't just another Psyker cult. They were a philosophical outlier, a mirror held up to everything broken in humanity's psychic relationship with the universe. And we smashed that mirror not because of what it reflected, but because deep down we recognized the tune, and we knew it would never leave us the same. It's strange how the stories that linger the longest are never the loudest. The Pale Choir didn't scream into history like the traitor legions. They didn't drown the stars in blood like the arch-enemy's hordes. They sang, quietly, deliberately, and then fell silent. But the silence they left behind, it still rings. You can feel it in the forgotten corridors of librarious vaults, in the shuddering pause before a warp jump, in the sudden stillness on the edge of a vox signal. It's not absence. It's resonance. And I think that's the part that gets to me most. Were they evil, dangerous, heretical? Maybe. but not in the way most would assume. They weren't drunk on power. They weren't seeking conquest or domination. If anything, their greatest sin was believing too deeply in something better, in a galaxy that could be healed instead of ruled, guided instead of broken. That's what makes them so hard to place. They don't fit neatly into our categories of light or darkness. They were different. And maybe that difference was too much. What if the Pale Choir really was our one chance to reshape our relationship with the warp? To move away from chains and cages and blind fear? What if they had found a way, not to control chaos, not to kill it, but to neutralize it? To dilute it with harmony? To redirect the flow of the Imperium through alignment instead of suppression? I think about that a lot, and not just in the abstract. I think about the Psykers we burn every year, the black ships filled with sobbing children, the sanctioned minds that fracture under the weight of isolation. What if all of that pain wasn't necessary? What if there was another way? The Imperium would never allow that kind of question to stand. Because if we start asking it, we have to confront the systems we've built, the pain we've normalized, the pyres we've lit, not out of necessity but out of habit. And the Pale Choir, they were the crack in that facade, a crack that sang, a flaw that sounded like hope. Of course, it's easy to romanticize, easy to turn a lost cult into a symbol. I know that. There's always the possibility that they were playing with forces they couldn't control. That whatever harmony they found was artificial or temporary or worse, manipulated by something lurking just beneath the surface. But even then, even if they were wrong, at least they were reaching for something different, something more. And in a universe that demands obedience, maybe even the act of reaching is heresy enough. I've spent cycles reading through forbidden records, decoding fragments, cross-referencing Psyker rites and navigator chants and Mechanicus data logs. And the more I dig, the more I feel like I'm hearing echoes, not proof, not answers, but resonance. Like the Pale Choir isn't just a chapter from the past, like they're still out there, scattered like harmonics in the void, waiting for someone to understand, to listen. Maybe they weren't the final solution. Maybe they were the first draft, the prototype of a better relationship with the warp, not through suppression, not through violence, but through shared frequency, through trust, through song. I don't know if we'll ever see anything like them again. Maybe the galaxy's just too broken now, too loud. But the idea, the melody, it's still there, beneath the static, and that's something. So what do you think? Were they misguided dreamers or forgotten visionaries? A threat to humanity, or the only ones who truly tried to save it from itself? I want to know what you hear in their silence. If this story struck a chord with you, if it made you curious, unsettled, or just a little more thoughtful about how the Imperium treats its own soul, then let's keep the conversation going. Leave a comment, share your theories, challenge mine. Maybe somewhere in all our scattered voices, we'll find something that hums in unison. And if you want more stories like this, the ones the archives bury and the Inquisition fears, you know what to do. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, and stay tuned. There's always another lost harmony to chase. And together, maybe we'll hear it again.